Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation on the topic of advocate for you and me. For those who might not have met me yet, my name is Tenney, also formerly known as Lena. If that gives you context, that's a recent name change. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I am honored to be the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for the College of Pharmacy at The Ohio State University. And for a little bit of context, Advocate for You and Me is the theme of the entire academic year for 2021-22 in the College of Pharmacy, as we work to make sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a bunch of one-off events, but rather something that is longitudinal, something that is built into every consideration within the college, and something that we're doing on a daily basis and not only in a workshop space. And thank you for engaging in this workshop, whether live or via the recording. So when we think about this theme of advocating for you and me, I think one of the first things that tends to come up for me personally from my experience is to think through, the possibly innumerable number of experiences that we might have had on a personal level and in group settings of these moments where bias, discrimination, some kind of isms or phobia or a combination of several of those really come to the fore, and that we might experience these firsthand, perhaps as a target or as a witness. And in all of my years of doing trainings around things like implicit bias and microaggressions, the number one question that always follows is, okay, that's helpful to be able to spot those things, and what do we do about it? And there's a lot of common hesitations and even just, lack of experience necessarily or space to try out actionable skills. So we are going to try to lay some foundations here today for those kinds of actionable skills through some sharing of research in spaces like sociology and psychology, and then a lot of self-reflection, just to give a heads up. So there is no expectation to share beyond your capacity today. And a lot of this will be really internal, and that it's going to be your truth as opposed to something that all of us on a webinar can come to agreement on, because we're all different people with different identities and positionalities and experiences. So with that said, a lot of the time we hear this term advocacy, and sometimes we're not all on the same page about what that means. And we could pick apart a million different scholarly or popular definitions of this. And I think that Samantha Power really summed it up really well in this quote where she said that all advocacy is at its core an exercise in empathy. So when we're talking about advocate for you and me today, what we're really getting at is the idea of having empathy and extending it to ourselves, which can be really difficult for some of us, and to others, right? So it's a both and of you and me. But again, this is an exercise in humanity. And that is different than a lot of popular narratives that have emerged, over decades, certainly, but especially in recent years around things like, if you're familiar with the phrase cancel culture, right? So the idea is, if you don't do political correctness, which is a term that actually arose in the 90s as backlash towards progressive movements for reduction in things like racism, sexism, and homophobia, right? So that was really the key phrase in the 90s and 2000s. And now the key phrase is cancel culture. I want to suggest instead that this is empathy culture, right? Holding folks accountable and providing the opportunity to learn and know better if they didn't already know something is one of the most empathetic and kind and generous things that we can do for one another. And if you're interested in that kind of mentality, I would definitely recommend learning a bit more about the idea of restorative justice as an approach. And essentially the idea of restorative justice is, again, advocacy grounded in empathy, where the goal, instead of punishment when something happens, so punishment for people who are viewed as perpetrators, in restorative justice, instead, we hold space for empathy for everyone involved. And we do focus on primarily healing for those who are affected, and also space to do better for those who have perpetrated something, whether it's on accident or on purpose. So we'll be talking quite a bit about advocacy as empathy today. So I would suggest that one of the best first steps that we can take in our journey in being an advocate for ourselves and for others is to know some of these things that research has shown us, and that some of these framings in this research might just validate your own lived experience of how it is that humans tend to socialize, how it is that over thousands of years of evolution in various different societies. And in the current context here, we'll be talking about the context of the United States. What are these kinds of norms and predilections that humans tend to have, especially when we're interacting in these kinds of sort of high pressure situations? A couple key points that I think are really, really relevant. The first is recognition that we live in a structurally inequitable society. We could have an entire conference, and there are entire conferences with the research that demonstrates this, much less people sharing their lived experience, right? But to accept, I think proactively, that this is the way things are, and to be able to engage according to that. So the first practical tip I would suggest here is switching from a if bias emerges mentality. This is certainly the mentality that I had growing up and into adulthood until someone shared that it might be more helpful to have a when bias inevitably emerges, what will I do mentality. And I can, give a personal testimony to the fact that that switch in mentality alone is one of the most basic but most helpful things in terms of advocating for self and others, is recognizing it doesn't have to be shocking every time something racist happens. It can still be shocking on that emotional level, right? That shock that is born out of, oh my gosh, how can someone treat someone else this way, right? But not necessarily shock in a surprise type way. And Twitter is has a million iterations of this, of the phrase of disappointed but not surprised. And I think that that is a really healthy way for us to navigate a world that we know is inequitable. It's not your fault. It's not my fault. We inherited these systems. We didn't make the rules and regulations and policies and social norms that have been around for hundreds of years. And we can recognize the inequities of society and work towards doing what we can in our spaces with our various strengths and talents in the context of our identities as well. So switching to the when bias happens, what will I do mentality can help us disrupt what is known as the bystander effect. And if you're not familiar, really briefly, the bystander effect comes out of sociological research that essentially finds that oftentimes the dynamics of a situation are influenced by the number of people witnessing it. So in emergency or urgent situations, what tends to happen, though not always, is that when there is a larger number of people present as witnesses, that there is a reduced chance that any person will take meaningful, concrete action in that scenario. Whereas if there is, for example, only one witness, something that's urgent, almost always that person takes responsibility and takes action. This is really helpful for us to think about, because as we navigate these kinds of comments and microaggressions in the workplace, in the lab, in everyday life, amongst family members, whether chosen or blood, out at the grocery store, as we encounter these things, that we can recognize, hey, it is totally normal and typical human behavior for us to be unsure whether we should intervene when we witness something that's making us uncomfortable or that we think is not appropriate or is flat out wrong. How the bystander effect tends to manifest is someone will, let's use the example of a team meeting at work. If someone makes one of those sort of off-color jokes that uses stereotypes as a punchline, and we notice that happening, and in our brain, a million things are happening. Some of the common phrases we might think are, did they really just say that? Or, oh my gosh, what? That can't be right. I must have misheard. Or we might think like, it is 2021. What are you doing? And various levels of like anger and again, like that sort of surprise element of shock, being really disappointed to hear that, feeling super uncomfortable. So a lot of these things transpire rapidly within our own brains and bodies. And oftentimes we are reading the room. So we're trying to see if other people are sharing in that discomfort and also want to say something and or even recognize that what happened is not appropriate. So oftentimes, and this feel free to wave or thumbs up if this resonates with you, oftentimes in these did they really just say that moments, we are thinking things through and perceiving the room, and basically the entire room is a bunch of people being silent and awkwardly avoiding eye contact with one another because no one is sure what to do. No one knows, no one knows, is it my responsibility to speak up, or should the person leading the meeting speak up? Should the person with that identity speak up, or should the person who doesn't have that identity speak up? We're going to analyze a lot of those situational contexts today as we prepare ourselves to be equipped and empowered to speak. But I just want to normalize that is super, super common. I still feel that, even though, this is what I do for work. I still feel that in these instances oftentimes. And I have to remind myself, okay, the bystander effect is real. It really is composed of diffusion of responsibility, which is the idea of we outsource and think, well, someone else will surely do something. And also the fact that humans by nature are pretty socially anxious creatures. And a lot of that is about the anxiety and concern of repercussions for when we unknowingly violate social norms or expectations. So there's a lot of pressure, right, in the idea to be, what if I'm the only one who thinks this is uncomfortable and I speak up and everyone's like, you're being too sensitive, or all the other phrases that we often encounter when folks speak up about bias, where people minimize the situation or say you're making too big a deal about it, or don't let your feelings get hurt, when the reality of the situation is actually that, again, we live in a structurally inequitable society. And unless we have the courage and wherewithal to speak up in those moments of bias that are interpersonal, we are never going to be able to make major structural change. We need both the interpersonal and the structural, and many of us might not have a whole lot of structural influence or power. We might not be legislators who can vote on how our society is going to run, but we can be everyday ambassadors of what kind of society we want to form, right? So I want to invite you to, when you find your brain doing those things automatically, because it's pretty wired into our cognition, to remind yourself, wait, the bystander effect is real, it's very powerful, and I do not have to be subject to it. I can choose to be an active bystander. I can choose to say something. And in my many years of experience learning to be an active bystander, pretty consistently what I found is if you are willing to have the courage to be the first person to acknowledge that something's amiss, almost always at least one other person will back you up. And that's a reminder that if you're not the first person to speak, someone else speaks first, make sure you back them up, and to do so publicly, if at all possible. There's certainly plenty of stories that have been told, primarily from Black women, about attempts to do advocacy for self and others, particularly in workplace settings, such as in higher education, of speaking up for truth and justice and what's right, and no one backing the person up, and it getting really uncomfortable and there potentially being backlash and retaliation, but that a bunch of people in that meeting email the Black woman who spoke up for everyone and privately say, thank you for speaking up. I didn't have the wherewithal to speak up, or I was too afraid, or there was too much risk. And while that is understandable because we do have to weigh risks, at the same time, it is much more powerful when we back each other up publicly. That way we can not only have a united front, but also so that any backlash doesn't happen against one person who is more vocal, but rather the more people that speak up, the less likely that there will be social repercussions. Another thing to keep in mind is that there are a number of research-based, most common human reactions to these kinds of emergency situations. And a lot of this work is really drawn from the idea of like a physical threat. But what the research is finding is that our bodies and minds actually have almost identical reactions to existential threats as they do to physical threats. So humans are pretty much wired to respond in the same way from being chased by a tiger, as your body is likely to respond in a similar way when someone does something that is racist. So I just want to normalize some of these and how they tend to manifest in bodies, and think through, what typically is my reaction. It might depend on the situation, but it's really helpful to know how your body and mind tend to react. So most folks are familiar with fight and flight, pretty self-explanatory. Sometimes in these urgent situations, we get really amped up and geared up. We might feel that surge of adrenaline in our body, and we might sort of square up our shoulders and think, I cannot let this happen. I'm going to say something, and respond with assertiveness and things like that. That's pretty typical. It is also very typical for us to have a flight response in which our body wants to get away from the situation. It's not so much about speaking up and saying the truth and being loud and clear. Oftentimes our bodies and our brains want us to simply exit the situation. And how that looks in everyday life is sometimes we sort of end the conversation in a rushed way without addressing the situation because it's so socially awkward that no one wants to be there anymore. So that's extremely common. A lot of folks are also familiar with the idea of freeze. This is, I would say, maybe the most common one that folks share with me is this concern of, well, people say something and I'll recognize in the moment that it's not okay. And I'll want to say something, but it's like I physically can't. That is super common and very normal. And again, it is a physiological response for many of us, not just psychological. There are ways that we can get around that. But ways that shows up might be arguing in our own head with ourselves about what to do, and then not realizing that 5 or 10 minutes have passed. And when we have the wherewithal to say something, it feels like the moment is kind of gone. This is one that I have experienced personally many, many times in my life, partially because of my anxiety. So for all the anxious people out there, you are definitely not alone. We will talk about some possibilities for if you tend to have a freeze response, how you can disrupt that, and or how you can buy yourself time and come back to a situation after you've had time to think about it, and lower the sort of emotional stakes. One that there's not quite as much research about and isn't as popular, there's also a trauma response known as fawn. So the idea here is that sometimes in emergency situations or in trauma, that the person who is experiencing it might become sort of obsequious or, fawn over or be particularly kind to or flattering even towards the person who is causing harm. And it might seem counterintuitive, and there's a few reasons for this. One is as a trauma response, so it's less of a physiological response and more of a mode of survival. Fawn is actually a really useful survival tool, right? Particularly when you are in a situation in which physical safety, potentially also emotional safety might be at play. So fawn gives us the ability to get through the situation. It doesn't always meet our goals. If one of our goals is to speak up or to provide a different perspective or to maybe try to change someone's mind, right? But I just want to normalize that fawn is a pretty common experience, and ways that this can manifest can include someone saying something that maybe is a microaggression against you, an identity that you hold, and having all these thoughts in your head of how am I going to navigate this? This is such a risky situation. I can't afford to get fired, or I don't want grandma to never talk to me again. Or, there's this person that I really care about and I don't want to upset them. Or it could be a stranger at the grocery store and you want to avoid any kind of potential escalation of their behavior, right? There's all these situations in which we might fawn in order to get through the situation. There are ways that we can get through the situation and still be able to speak or recognize when it is simply not feasible for us to speak up. And there are some times that the risk might outweigh the benefits. Another one that's really, really intriguing is the ways in which humans tend to interpret silence among groups. So this research comes out of, there's a whole field of research on sexual assault prevention. And that's actually the bystander effect research. Often, a lot of it is tied to that research as well. And what they found is that people who are witnesses or targets of bias interpret silence from a group and individuals differently than the perpetrators who have said or done the thing. So the example here, and as a general content warning, anytime we're talking about bias and interrupting it, there is certainly going to be difficult content and subjects. So I'm just going to give a heads up. Right now, I'm going to give a couple pretty vague examples, but some examples of ways that this manifests and how the research was done in regards to sexual assault prevention. So essentially, researchers spoke with people who were perpetrators of sexual assault and gender-based violence. And in these interviews, trying to understand where folks were coming from, they got a couple of key insights that now motivate the way that we do victims and survivors advocacy. One was the idea that interpersonal violence is actually not about sexual contact. It is actually motivated by a desire to feel powerful. And you might already be familiar with that, or that might just validate experiences you've had. And that can be something like male attempts to control public space. So catcalling, right? Catcalling is a form of interpersonal and gender-based violence. And it's not physical violence necessarily. It is, however, like rhetorical and emotional violence. It is not an earnest attempt to ask someone on a date, because I think there's zero examples ever of someone catcalling someone and the person being like, "You're right, I super want to get to know you as a person. Let's go on a date," right? That's not the intention, whether it's recognized or not. It is to inform people with marginalized identities, most often women, that they are in a space that is not theirs to control, or that there's this assertion of power or dominance in making someone feel unsafe or uncomfortable, oftentimes for the joy of the person saying the thing, right? All kinds of messed up. And this is super helpful for us to know when we're thinking about being an active bystander. So the way that this relates to interpretations of silence is that because this is about power and control on the perpetrator side, perpetrators interpret silence as agreement with their actions or words. Meanwhile, those of us who are witnessing these things happen, we interpret our own and other people's silence as disagreement, right? We interpret our silence as discomfort, that no one knows what to say because that was so messed up. But what they found is, for example, when someone tells a quote unquote rape joke, it's never a joke, right? But this is how perpetrators often frame it. When everyone in the room is silent, the person who has said that thing that's awful interprets that as everyone agreeing and everyone being okay with it. Whereas again, any of us who are paying attention and are not in support of that, when we're doing the looking around with wide eyes and not being able to fix our face and we're like, what just happened? We are interpreting that dynamic as all of us disagreeing. So because it's interpreted so differently, I think it's really important to be mindful of what silence means to different people and to break that silence, right? So this is a big part of why advocating needs to be public, right? We can't only do this in private. I know within my own socialization as a higher education and student affairs professional, many times I've heard the phrase, praise in public, critique in private. I would suggest that there is certainly a time and place for that, especially when we're talking about things like professional development and skills building. And when there are manifestations of bias and harm actively occurring, that is not appropriate. When harm occurs in public, repair needs to happen in public. Otherwise, it gives this appearance of silence and that we are implicitly or tacitly agreeing with what has happened. Any questions or clarifications we have so far? Or examples of where you've seen this or anything like that? Excellent. Feel free to type in the chat or unmute anytime. A couple more research-based pieces on human socialization. So here we're going to use this term racial anxiety, and this comes out of critical legal studies. I want to be clear, this is a particular term for a particular type of theory that has been proposed. In the prior two presidential elections in the United States, we saw a lot of headlines talking about voters' racial anxiety. I want to be clear, that's not what we're talking about. When they were talking about economic anxiety, racial anxiety, that many white people expressed racial anxiety about, for example, by 2050, the prediction about the population is that it'll be majority people of color for the first time in the United States, and that some white people experience anxiety about becoming the minority, which my talking point, if this is useful to you, please feel free to borrow, is to simply ask the question, why? Are minorities treated poorly in this country or something? And that can help flip that narrative. So we're not talking about that popular use of the term racial or economic anxiety. Rather, we are talking about the idea that is used in conjunction with implicit bias and stereotype threat, that most people prior to and during discussions about race and racism in particular, though I would say we could draw some parallels to other identities as well, most people are pretty anxious about these kinds of interactions, and for a variety of reasons. And the evidence shows that there really are, it's not just that everyone's anxious or most people are anxious, it's that there are particular manifestations and reasons that are differential between populations. So for people of color, most often what this looks like is, for example, if you are going to tune into a webinar about how to do anti-racism, for many people of color, the concern when going into that space is that something racist will happen and that the person of color will have to deal with it. So there is this concern of, even when we're trying to discuss anti-racism, that there's a good chance something racist will happen. And that happens, right? Microaggressions happen in any space, including well-intended ones, right? For white people, the racial anxiety is significantly different. Oftentimes, for those of us who are white, myself included, when we enter these spaces, we are actually concerned that we are going to be one of the accidental perpetrators of the racism. We are worried that we will say the wrong word, that we'll use out-of-date language, that we will accidentally say a microaggression that we didn't realize was not helpful or was harmful. And for good reason, right? Like, the motivation here is to do no harm. And for people of color, the motivation is, I don't want to experience more harm while we're trying to reduce harm. And ways that this manifests include like really awkward attempts to connect. If you've ever just felt like really awkward and weird and socially anxious in these kinds of spaces, very common. Sometimes we just avoid eye contact or make it really short. Sometimes we just don't talk, or we have really short interactions. And we can even think about this in terms of reflecting on the past year and a half. For example, more and more, I would say a record number of white people have been engaging in discussions about race and anti-racism since the murder of George Floyd, right? That is really a flashpoint we can identify that shifted the social landscape. And so as more white folks enter these spaces and seek to do anti-racism, it is inevitable that there will be mistakes made, right? And that we will have some of these really awkward encounters with one another while we try to do better. One of the things that we can do to address that is recognize that not only are our racial anxieties different by population, but the risks that they carry, which risk is really the big motivator behind the anxiety, that is also differential. So this is the work of Dr. Cheryl Matthias, who does a lot of work around whiteness in higher education, and it is being summarized here in a tweet by a doctoral student. And I want to invite us to think about, for example, how we facilitate spaces, whether that's formally through a workshop, or if it is facilitating space around the dinner table or with friends, where we more or less discuss these kinds of things depending on the nature of those relationships, right? But when these things are discussed, that is really important to be proactive, especially if we have formal authority or power in a space, and acknowledge that these conversations can be risky, and take it a step further. So don't stop at, hey, it's hard to talk about race. Almost everyone has a hard time talking about race, but let's do it anyway. And add a recognition of the differential risks, saying something like, and I also want to recognize racial anxiety that might be in the room, and that it might be different for people of color and for white people. And I also want to acknowledge that the risk is very different, right? So the reason white people tend to be anxious is the risk that one will mess up and accidentally cause harm, and therefore be labeled a racist and or bad person, right? That is really the root of the fear, is I'll mess up and it's gonna mean people think I'm a bad person, or that I am a bad person, which is two different things, right? For people of color, that risk is not existential. There's an extraordinary amount of evidence that shows that talking about race and anti-racism for people of color is extremely risky. It carries a lot of potential for social consequences, such as ostracization. In the space of higher education, oftentimes what we see is, again, predominantly Black women speaking up about their experience of, hi, the university or the department said they wanted to do anti-racism work. I spoke up when I noticed racism, and as a result, I was either iced out or fired. And that's partially because of pre-existing stereotypes, such as the quote, angry Black woman stereotype, which is problematic in a million ways. And one of that is we probably should be angry about racism because racism is a bad thing. And that would be a whole other webinar. But thinking through the difference between, for example, a Black woman speaking up when experiencing or witnessing racism, but when her white colleague says something, there is rarely that same risk. It's not that there's no risk, right? There might be some icing out or ostracization. There's also a decent chance that the white colleague will be seen as an advocate, right? So when people advocate from their own identities, they're often identified as a problem, according to the work of scholar Sarah M.Ed. So this idea that to articulate a problem, to identify a problem in an institution makes one personally a problem, that loud person is being annoying about constantly bringing up racism when it's a person of color, but that the white person who is constantly talking about racism, and this is my personal experience, 100%, is often viewed as a great advocate, a really good ally, and might even, like, I don't know, win some awards for it. So thinking about those risks, not only the bad things, but the ways in which people with majority identities can actually benefit in some ways by being vocal advocates, in which people with the identity are silenced, marginalized, and pushed out. I would suggest that one of the takeaways is not just acknowledging this differential risk when we're having these conversations, but making sure that we are doing cross-identity work, right? So that white folks are speaking up against anti-racism because the risk is a lot less. That straight people are speaking up. We saw this quite a bit with marriage equality of, once a majority of straight people were speaking up, that's when we really saw a lot of social change. And it is LGBTQ activists who got us to that point. And there's this tipping point in which when folks with the majority identity start saying this is the right thing to do, oftentimes that is when real significant change starts happening. It also suggests that we account for natural human defensiveness. So what we find in the literature is that one of the biggest concerns of people is their own self-perception as a good person. So sans people who might have diagnosable mental illnesses that don't have this dynamic present, the vast majority of people want to be good people and want to do the right thing, and also want to be seen as a good person. Again, those are two different things, but there's some things that we can do about this, right? So we can think about this concept of motivated cognition, this idea that we're, trying to do the right thing, that we're thinking through our actions of wanting to be and be perceived as a good person. And I think we can really tap into that, especially if we are working alongside folks who we really genuinely believe have good intentions and messed up this time, right? We are all gonna mess up. That is the struggle of anti-racism work, of diversity, equity, inclusion work, is that no one can ever be perfect. We're all on a learning curve. We're all on a journey. And what do we do about So we find also that, again, a lot of this decision making is not necessarily logical. A lot of it is grounded in these emotions, such as white people wanting to avoid the label of racist, because arguably it's the worst thing that a white person can be called, since there's no slurs for us. So when we can recognize this, one of the things that we can do that's promising is when we're talking about things like racism, that when appropriate, we can frame it and be like, hey, this is a type of hatred, when we know, it's explicit, it's causing immediate harm. There's all of these sorts of things where it's like, yes, that is a real and powerful part of how racism works in our society. And that oftentimes when we're working with well-intended people, that their motivation isn't hatred against the other, it's self-preservation for their own well-being. And we find this all the time when folks think about things like affirmative action. A lot of white folks' reaction to affirmative action is this idea of, it's not that I don't think people of color should get to go to college. I'm just concerned that it means that I or my kid or my grandkid will not have as high of a chance of getting accepted to an elite institution because there might be fewer slots available, right? So that's the difference between self-preservation and hatred. And the end result is still opposition to policies that would create equity, such as affirmative action, right? So that difference between intentions and outcomes, but that's a powerful space for us to recognize so that we can communicate with those who are well-intended and are not trying to do harm. Which goes back to intent and impact. Just to summarize really quickly, I want to invite folks to assume best intentions if you would like to. I'm going to complicate that with this article that's linked below. And this is an article by Ruth Terry, who's a Black woman journalist who really sort of complicates that mantra of assume best intentions and really asks the question basically like from her own experience as a Black woman, what do you do when it's pretty clear that the person doesn't have good intentions, right? Like if someone harms you over and over and over again, is it fair to ask to assume best intentions? So, I can't prescribe any conclusions to anyone about that, but I will invite folks to read the article. It's challenging in a very different framing. Feel free to copy and paste this language in your daily conversation. I have found it to be really effective with those folks who are not intending to do harm and that their impact does not align with their good intentions, right? I use this quite a bit when I work with parents of young transgender children in some of my outside work. And often what we find at social gatherings and advocacy spaces is that, the reason the parents are there with their kids are because they support and love their kid and they want to do what's best for them, right? These aren't like deeply transphobic people who are trying to not let their kiddo live their most authentic life. They're opting into this space. So there's not malintent here. And not infrequently, sometimes these parents will use, for example, outdated language that might be considered a slur by most of the community. And so when that happens, that we can talk with parents in a loving way and say, hey, mom, dad, parent, I know you really care about your kid and their coming out process. That's exactly why I wanted to check in about that term that you just used. So it turns out that the T word that ends with a Y, that's actually considered a slur by the vast majority of trans people. And so I just wanted to make you aware so that you don't fall into accidentally saying it around your kid who might perceive it really differently than how you intended it, right? So even though you didn't mean to be transphobic, the outcome can still be that trans people hear that word and get activated or triggered or feel harmed, right? So leading with, I know you're an ally, I know you're trying, I know you don't have any bad intentions, and that's why we're having this conversation. And part of that is that a lot of us do not want to invest our time and energy in people that we think are beyond hope or have bad intentions, right? So this goes back to empathy. That accountability is really empathetic and generous because it's us giving of our time and expertise to help someone out when they've stepped in it. And something that's a little bit more specific, and I won't spend much time on this, but we'll invite folks to go engage in some of the conversations about white fragility. Essentially, this is the suggestion that it does not take much for white people to get pretty upset and defensive when we're talking about race and racism. And just to uplift some of the most common reactions to this, we often see these really big displays of emotion. For example, a white person beginning to yell at everyone because the subject has turned to racism and they're feeling uncomfortable or personally attacked. I have definitely witnessed the leaving the stress-inducing situation, right? So giving a keynote at a conference, and in this case, it wasn't white fragility, it was cisgender fragility, of just introducing myself with they, them pronouns and explaining what that meant, and someone in a huff leaving the convention center because they were uncomfortable with my existence, I guess, I don't know. And the thing here is the way that these things function intentionally or unintentionally, that's key, right? Intent versus impact. The function of these kinds of outbursts and behaviors is to reinstate white racial equilibrium, which is an academic term of saying that white person's personal comfort with never having to deal with race or racism. And again, this is about racism specifically, but I think there's strong parallels to other areas. I'll invite folks on their own time to explore some of these, and we'll make sure the slides are available to look through these. But here are some suggestions from Dr. Akapati, who does a lot of work in this area about how we can ground ourselves and navigate white fragility in the moment and by anticipating it. Excellent. Step 2. So when you know how humans work, you also have to know how you work as a human. And this kind of self-reflection is really invaluable. Again, the idea is, learn to know yourself, to search realistically and regularly the processes of your own mind and feelings, right? And these things will change over time as you learn and grow and experience different elements of life. There is nothing wrong with shifting your mentalities and behaviors once you know more about a situation or a topic, right? And so this is really going to be an invitation to reflect on things like your values, priorities, and strengths. So in that vein, I want to invite folks to think about, and you are welcome to share this in the chat or unmute. You are welcome to write it down in a private space for yourself to reflect on. Whatever that looks like for you is fantastic. And thinking about when these situations happen, because like, did they really just say that moments? What might make you like hesitant to act? You might still do or say something, but many of us have this hesitation beforehand. We discussed that a lot with the bystander effect, right? So when you see racism and other isms happening, even if you say something, what gives you that moment's pause? And connecting that to our bodies, for you personally, why might that be the case? Is there some kind of like underlying factor there? And how does that show up in your brain and or your body? And just to give an example, I'll share some of my experience on this. So sometimes when I witness these things happening, I'll feel this hesitation and I'll be asking myself, like, is this my place to say something? And then I'm hesitant of like, I don't know, am I overstepping, especially if it's not my identity, right? I don't want to like silence someone who might want to speak for themselves, right? There's this whole question of the white savior complex that's been written about a lot of, folks with majority identities being like, I will save you when folks are capable, willing, et cetera, to advocate for themselves, right? Other hesitations I sometimes have, sometimes it's like social consequences, if I'm being honest. There's this question of like, if I repeatedly am this person and interrupt bias, like every time it happens, at a certain point you start getting accused of being like the feminist killjoy and other things like that. Of like, see, you used to be a really funny person and then you got into all this social justice stuff. It's like, no, I used to make a lot of jokes that were complicit in the oppression of myself and others, and now I try not to do that. But I still think I'm relatively funny. I don't know. And how that might look for me personally, usually it's like that butterflies in the stomach feeling, or sometimes it feels like, when you're on an elevator and it's going down and it drops that extra floor really suddenly and you feel that in your gut. I get that a lot, which is not helpful when you're feeling physically unwell while trying to figure out how to respond. And again, it goes back to the fight, flight, freeze, and the idea that our bodies respond to these existential threats as if they were a physical threat. So want to welcome any thoughts that folks might have about your own experience or any questions building on this too.
Yeah, I can share a thought. I First of all, this has been really helpful. I think just putting it all in context. And I think personally, I've been thinking a lot about that bystander effect. And I think a large portion of what makes me hesitant to speak up or act um, is the idea that, well, I haven't tried this before. And so it's like kind of like riding a bike. Like the first time you take off the training wheels, you're super nervous and you might hit the front brake instead of the back brake. And so I think it just comes with practice too. Like the best way to mitigate that hesitation would be to just try. So I think that like finding the courage, and then I agree a lot with the physical like manifestations of this. Palms are sweaty and like I have this kind of like nervous twitch like tremor. But even now, like my palms are sweaty. Just in speaking up in this discussion. So definitely helpful to think about in terms of knowing myself.
Thank you so much for sharing. My palms are sweaty right now too, so sweaty solidarity. um, or like hand shakiness. Like that's definitely, I might not even notice I'm feeling it until I see my hands shaking and I'm like, yeah, so much of that resonates and is something that I hear pretty often from folks. In our society, there are not a lot of low risk spaces to try these kinds of skills, right? In school, there might, you get homework, you have practice, and then you have tests. And in the real world, when it comes to challenging bias, there's no practice exams. It's just like, boom, someone did something super ableist, and now we got to figure out how we're going to respond, right? I would suggest that one thing that can be helpful is if you have folks that you trust, whether it's friends, family, colleagues, whoever it might be, that you have an existing relationship with, if you can ask each other for that kind of lower risk space to practice, and it might feel goofy, right? It might be like, hey, I'm practicing these intervention techniques. Can I just kind of like run it by you as like a scenario or something? Or like, oh, like let's have some workshops in which we do skill building and practice scenarios after this workshop, which we will, right? When we practice in those spaces, it can become less difficult to say something. I'm also going to normalize, for me, and from what I've heard from a lot of folks who've done this for a long time, you don't necessarily ever reach a space where it's easy or comfortable, right? That when there is risk, there is risk. And we might get better and better at speaking despite the risk, or at analyzing the risk and deciding how to approach it. And that probably most of us are not going to reach some kind of enlightened state in which we are always able to say exactly the right thing at the right time. It's just not realistic. And one thing that might be comforting in that space is there's actually some research in higher education classrooms in which they found that the first time there was a manifestation of bias in the class was when students with marginalized identities begin to disengage socially, raise their hand less, speak in discussion less, participate in group projects less, because that space no longer feels welcoming. What they found is when the instructor intervened, it mattered less to the students. Like the students didn't particularly have strong feelings about what it was the instructor said, but when the instructor said something to address the bias, whether in the moment or in the next class period, the next time we meet, that effect didn't hold, that marginalized students continued to engage in that space because even though there was bias, the space was restored. And it was clear that like that kind of action is not going to be welcome. And I think that assures me when I am not sure that I like have the expertise to say something, right? If it's like, I might not know a whole lot about Sikh identities and why Sikh men wear turbans. And you don't have to be an expert on every identity to speak up, right? So if you hear someone, we saw this a lot after 9/11, right? There were hate crimes against Sikh men wearing turbans who were mistaken for Muslims, and that this anger was acted out, right? And thinking through like, oh no, we can still speak up. You don't have to know the religious reasoning behind covering your hair to say like, hey, that's not cool. And even if they are, like, they're not Muslim, but even if they are, that's still not a problem because all of these things, right? Thank you so much for sharing. There's a lot in there that was powerful that you shared. Excellent. All right. We are going to keep that in mind, and a few suggestions of what we do with this is checking in about your mindset and journey, like where you are right now, which is not going to be the same as yesterday or 5 minutes from now necessarily. So I find this tool useful in thinking about the different zones that we might be in during our journey. And to be really clear, it is like a progression from left to right, but we can be anywhere on this sort of scale at any time, depending on the situation. The general idea is to grow from the fear zone towards the growth zone. So we spend more time in growth zone than in fear zone. And essentially, this is being honest with ourselves, even though it can be difficult, about how we view things. So for example, when we talked about white fragility, a lot of that is about maintaining one's own comfort during uncomfortable conversations. So when we're operating in the fear zone, we oftentimes work to preserve our own comfort. I strive to be comfortable. When we're in more of a learning space, we start educating ourselves about race and structural racism. And when we're spending more time in the growth zone, we're actually talking with others about how racism shows up, how we can identify it, right? So I'd say that showing up to a session like this, this is a great moment of like being in a growth zone, learning into growth, right? And that we ask different questions and we behave differently when we're in different spheres of this. But this can help us be accountable to where we are in the moment from day to day. Another thing that I've personally found really helpful is the fixed to growth mindset here that we talk about in terms of that focus on comfort versus the focus on courage. So these are really common rhetorics, and it just identifies, is this more focused on comfort or on having the courage to make change? One that really resonates with me in particular the last few years is this intrusive thought of, it's not going to make a difference what I do. Nothing's going to change, right? Like the structures that be are too powerful. This is baked into the system, like all of these kinds of things. That's not wrong. It's not incorrect. It's also a self-comforting kind of cognition, right? Because it's more comfortable to be, to say like, I don't have to act because it doesn't make a difference if I do or not, right? So it's kind of really interesting logic that we have. And when I find myself thinking this, I do my best to remind myself, no, things do change and things do happen when I have courage, when I speak up, and when I remember, this isn't just about me and this other person who made a comment. This isn't just about me having made a comment and someone calling me in or out, right? This is a broader effort that we're all in this together to make society better, even if that's like harm mitigation, as opposed to fixing the whole system all at once, right? Also thinking through your motivations through time, about your approaches. I really love this quote about what we would think about as allyship and helping people with marginalized identities that we don't have. And a reminder of that really it's common for us to feel like, I'm helping someone. And the suggestion here is, can we reframe to your liberation is bound up with mine, let us work together, right? This advocacy as empathy work, that we're all human beings. We live in this society, we're all in it together. The civil rights adage of your freedom is bound up in my freedom, let's get free together, right? And thinking through how it's not so much about, being a hero or a savior, even a good person, that cognition that we really value. It's about empathy and working together to make change. I also want to suggest that folks really be honest with oneself, and again, check in over time, because this does change sometimes with circumstance. about your personal priorities and values and the boundaries that you might need to set that relate to those. And there's a couple of ways that we can think about this in examining, what are my ultimate personal priorities and values? The question might be, what do I need to be able to sleep at night? What do I need in order to live with myself, right? And there are a million valid things that could be the answer to that. And a lot of it is based on circumstance. I'll give one example. When I was right out of grad school and had my first full-time job and wasn't getting a whole lot of remuneration and had just spent, hundreds of dollars moving across the country, right? So there was this financial imperative that I couldn't lose this job. And so even though the job was in an anti-racism space, there would still be moments where I would think that I was witnessing bias of some kind and think through like, can I afford to say something, right? That difference between if it's a colleague or friends that versus a boss's boss's boss, right? Being like, well, at the end of the day, I need to be able to pay my rent. And so at that phase in my life, very much my ultimate priority was being able to survive in an economic sense. That was necessary, right? As my life has changed, and as that is something that I've become economically secure, I've been afforded the luxury that these days I get to think, at the end of the day, my integrity is what really matters to me, because I have the convenience that I'm not financially responsible for any children, for any elders, for anyone with disabilities, or anyone else that there might be caretaking responsibility for, right? It's just me and the cats. And so I can take a little more risk these days because I'll be okay if there's some kind of social consequence or something like that. Financially, I'll be okay for now. And I do want to, again, honor both of those motivations are equally valid and honorable. And so if you have a mortgage and you have to pay for your kids' daycare, it is okay and not hypocritical for that to be a really high, if not highest priority. It just depends on the person and where you're at right now in life. A few suggestions from extremely wise people about what this can look like. So self-care should be one of our priorities, right? There's this idea of we can't be any good to others or to the movement if we are not good to ourselves, right? We've got to sustain this work. I also would suggest that your value is not wrapped up in what you can contribute to the movement for social justice, but that you as a human are inherently valuable and deserve self-care. But Audre Lorde reframes this away from things like bubble baths and suggesting that caring for yourself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation. That's an act of political warfare, which can sound sort of intimidating, but what she's talking about here is social change and advocacy as rooted in empathy, right? Also, the first time I stumbled across this quote, I was like, oh my gosh. This idea that self-care can also be not arguing with people who are committed to misunderstanding you. If you needed to hear validation or permission that you don't have to join in that Facebook or Twitter fight about something that someone has shown time and time again, they're not open to learning, that you're not going to be able to change their heart or mind. There is a point at which it is totally honorable and not hypocritical at all to reclaim your time, per Rep. Maxine Waters, right? To take care of yourself and to not spend all your time and energy trying to argue with people that really, truly are not going to hear what you're saying. Again, big difference in intentions there. If we know that someone has shown that they're not going to change, we can still speak up for what's right and minimize how much energy we let that energy vampire have. And that includes boundaries, right? So knowing your personal values, knowing your priorities, that you can think through, okay, so I can frame to myself, I will say something, I will speak up, unless this thing, right? That this will be the sort of exception, this will be the boundary where I can guilt-free, no, not today. Can't do this right now. We'll look at other ways to follow up, but in this particular moment, perhaps this external, visible advocacy for self and others is not what I can do because of risks and context and all of those kinds of things. And that includes establishing boundaries where you can love you and me simultaneously. Most often, folks tend to find this validating in regards to familial relationships in which you might really, really care about someone. and they might have some really awful opinions and say things that are just terrible and you can't get behind. And you're like, I love you so much. How do you think this way, right? Super common. Boundaries, boundaries. My therapist swears that they're a good thing, so I'm trying it, right? And thinking through, okay, again, if we're going to see each other at a holiday and someone constantly is like, well, I'm going to bring up this controversial political thing that we are polar opposites on. If you have spoken your truth, if they know where you stand, you have tried to make well-reasoned, research-based arguments and all of this kind of stuff, and it just isn't, it's just not being heard, it's not changing things. It is okay to set the boundary of like, hey, we have this argument every family gathering. I don't think we can agree to disagree necessarily, because this is like pretty important stuff and like human rights and stuff. But I will say, we're not changing each other's minds here, let's be honest. So can we just table this? And instead today, knowing that we don't agree, can we spend time with the grandkids, or spend time as a family on Zoom, or whatever it is that you are seeking to do in that space? Again, doesn't mean capitulate, doesn't mean say, I don't care about this, but there is a time and place where you can be like, I'm just not expending my energy in this way. The next step is, doing a good analysis of the situation with what information you have. We're never going to have all the information that we want or need, but here are some ideas. And then we'll wrap up here, recognizing where we're at on time. So a couple of suggestions about what that can look like, and it really can be like searching for clues in a magnifying glass. But some things to keep in mind are things like safety, and that could be physical safety. It's hard to talk about and acknowledge, but there's been a significant increase in hate crimes in the last few years in the United States. And so if yours or others' physical safety is ever in question, it is, again, not hypocritical, it is not cowardly to preserve yours and others' safety, right? I do highly recommend, there's some de-escalation trainings out there that you can actually learn how to de-escalate situations that you think might be edging towards that kind of like risky space. So when you, for example, this huge increase in anti-Asian racism and physical attacks that has plagued the United States this last year and a half. What can folks who are not Asian do to help de-escalate those situations, to make sure that the targets of that racism are protected and safe, while also working to protect all of us, right? There's some really good techniques for how to do that. Safety is also a bit broader than physical. And again, I'll give the example of something like street harassment. I have yet to, if being catcalled, I have yet to like stop and turn around and walk towards the young gentleman and inform him of how misogynistic it is to attempt to control this public space, and transphobic to assume I'm a woman, and that therefore he has some, like, no, I'm an educator at heart and I'm not doing all that, right? It is okay to simply move faster in the direction of your car or safety or a buddy or whatever it is, right? Power dynamics, we mentioned, the difference between the colleague with the same job title versus your boss's boss's boss. I don't think it's weird or inappropriate to consider those things. I think it's really, really strategic. And we can choose our strategies based off of the context. And some are going to look different than others, but they're not inherently superior in some kind of moral way or anything like that. Thinking through our roles and responsibilities, not just how we perceive them, but how others perceive them. A common one is for faculty and instructors. As much as you can work to have a flat classroom with minimal power dynamics, the perception of a student is always going to be that at the end of the day, an instructor controls their grade, right? So even if you've done like all of this work to have a really inclusive classroom, we still have to be mindful that that is the role that we're playing. And we have a responsibility, for example, to be the one to speak up when bias happens in our classroom, because we are the ones with the perceived and actual authority. Thinking about who's there and who's not there, I think a really vital part of this is sometimes folks are like, well, no one with that identity is here to have their feelings hurt, so should I say something? Is it worth it? I would suggest that if a racist tree falls in a racist forest and there's not a person of color around to hear it, it's still racism, right? So again, it's not only about individual feelings, those matter. It's also about systems change and speaking up for what we believe in and creating a culture at work at school, wherever it is, that we can all participate in. I would say it's actually particularly powerful if you notice that there doesn't seem to be anyone in the group that has that identity, which is probably why the person felt comfortable saying it, right? Oftentimes people won't say these biased things when they think that there's someone in the group who's there because they don't want called out. But again, that perpetrator mentality of like, well, we only do political correctness because it's socially required. But when we're in a space of only white people, we can make those like diet racism, racism light type jokes because no one is here to get upset about it. And it's like, nope, white person here gonna be upset about it, right? Because racism is always bad. So thinking there, what a great time to not have to worry about being a white savior. You can just be like, hey, like, I actually don't agree with that, or whatever strategy you want to use. Most of the time, people are going to chime in and back you up. You don't have to worry about overstepping or silencing someone, right? And my best suggestion when you think that there might be someone in the group that has that identity, they might want to advocate for themselves, right? They might be used to it, they might have an automatic comeback. It might be really empowering, whatever it is. You can leave the proverbial mic open for an awkward second or two. Don't let it go forever. And just like leave space for if someone wants to do self-advocacy that they can, and then back them up. And if for a million valid reasons, the person doesn't want to speak up for themselves in that moment, that you can frame your message accordingly. And you can say something like, you know, I'm not an expert on Sikh identities. And my understanding is that turbans are like a pretty important like religious thing. So I'm just like not super comfortable with the conversation we're having about turbans like being perceived as dangerous. Like I don't know enough, honestly. Does anyone know more? Because I'd love to learn. And if not, I'm gonna go do some research. And that can be a great model when you don't feel like you're the expert, when it's not your identity. You can still say something, acknowledge where you're at, and then say, I'm going to do research, or open that floor. Does anyone know better? I'd love to learn. And if not, like, that's okay. In the interest of time, I'll leave this as a reflection for folks. But thinking about these situations, does it feel the same or different for you personally? Again, there's no right or wrong, it's the self-knowledge. When these situations transpire and it's about an identity you have, so in some sense it's about you, whether that person realizes you have the identity or not, versus when the comment is made and it's not an identity you don't have. So for me, I would think through like, you know, as a white person, I am not directly targeted by systemic or interpersonal racism. So when something racist happens, that's not my identity, it's not about me. How does that feel? Versus when someone does or says something that is homophobic, like I am LGBTQ, been most of the letters at some point in my life, right? But thinking through like, hey, that is about me and my experience and my identities that I have. How does that feel and what do I do? And this knowledge, again, can be really helpful. Thinking about those underlying factors, the question of, do I tend to be more comfortable advocating for myself? Do I tend to be more comfortable and confident advocating for others? Lots of people fall into both of those camps. I'd say for me, I am much more likely to advocate for others than for myself. I'm pretty conflict avoidant by nature and have really had to learn and grow and practice things like interrupting bias. And I'll pretty much always do that for someone else. I very rarely do it for myself. A lot of the time I'm just too tired. The risk doesn't feel worth it. But since integrity is this really big theme in my life, I'm like, no, I'm gonna say something when it's someone else. But if I get misgendered, I'm kind of like, yeah, I know who I am, and I know that they weren't doing it intentionally. It's what it is, right? And thinking through like, how do you show up in those moments? Do you tend to have different emotional reactions that might need different strategies to navigate those emotions in the moment and figure out what it is you want to say then, or to have a pause and come back. One other suggestion is to consider a wide variety of different goals. Oftentimes this kind of like interrupting work or anti-bias work is reduced to changing hearts and minds, but there are a lot of goals that can be applicable depending on the situation. So that certainly is one. From an institutional perspective and as well, I think it's good for us to be honest and recognize that sometimes it's about damage control. On an interpersonal level, we might think of this as stopping the hurt that's happening and making sure it doesn't escalate. It can also be things like, making sure we're not violating laws like Title IX, right? Like that's important for us to consider. Our goal might be to educate people in the room who don't have that identity and might never have had the opportunity to have these kinds of discussions. It could be that we're not worried about the people with dominant identities. Maybe we're really focused on just validating and supporting the people who are being harmed in the moment. Maybe it's both, right? It's a whole laundry list. It could be about normalizing conversations, right? Depending on where your workplace culture is, or other kinds of spaces. It could be about incremental change, planting seeds. Like my own personal experience is that if it weren't for a lot of folks planting seeds and talking to me about things like privilege, which I was super resistant to when I first heard it, without that seed planting, I didn't transform overnight, certainly, but a couple of years of people giving me the opportunity to do better led to like, oh, I'm actually really passionate about this. It could be, you're just trying to give an example of like, hey, we can do this. You can be an advocate and be a professional. Those two things are actually not contrary to one another. This idea of holding space, living out your values, defending people's humanity. This is not exhaustive, but just some things to think about. And that depending on the goal, your strategy might be different. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip through or zoom through quite a bit of this. Just a reminder, there are things that we can ask ourselves when we assess intention and outcome about things like severity. So I would suggest that, if someone uses a racial slur, whether that was intentional or out of ignorance, the impact is still pretty severe, right? So I would suggest that we should pretty much always intervene if someone's using a racial slur. Again, the intent doesn't matter in the sense that the harm is happening. And assessing the intent can be really helpful in how we frame the conversation. So the conversation I'm going to have with a first-year student who came from a rural area, who has never met a person of color before they came to Ohio State, and has very little facility with updated racial language, and says something that is a couple decades outdated. Like that conversation is going to look different knowing that experience and that intent. We can have an educational conversation. I'm still going to say like, whoa, wait, we need to check in about this so that they don't keep saying it. But that is going to look a lot different than when, a couple years ago, known neo-Nazis wanted to have protests and meeting on Ohio State's campus. That conversation is not going to be the same, right? That intention is known. I'm not going to change their heart and mind in an educational conversation, right? So thinking through those kinds of assessments, as well as, if you're not sure whether to act, asking the question of like, well, what happens if I don't intervene? Will this potentially escalate? Will it cause more harm? Things like that. And the last few suggestions I'll leave are pretty practical about how to have the conversation itself. So one suggestion is always doing the internal work. So just like self-pointing Spider-Man, right? As much as we want to speak up for these things when they happen to others and to us, we also have to be reflective of the times that we could be the accidental perpetrators of that kind of harm too, right? So start with yourself, make sure you're doing the internal work. Calling other folks in and out can be helpful, and we've got to do the same thing for ourselves and be accountable when someone tells us that we messed up. I mentioned calling out and calling in. Essentially, the difference between these two strategies is calling out tends to be pretty direct. It can be abrupt. Oftentimes, it can be strongly worded, filled with passion, even anger, right? Calling in tends to be more educational, oftentimes more patient and gentle. It can be indirect. My personal mantra for how to decide between calling out and calling in is really severity of harm and intention. So again, how those two conversations look different for those two different people using a racial slur. I'm going to call in for that student who genuinely does not know better. I'm going to call out probably pretty hard for someone that I know is doing harm on purpose, right? Because we've got to stop the hurt and we've got to say, no, not here. That's not okay. And I would suggest that there's a lot of space of like, rather than accidentally seeming pedantic, I'm like, oh, I've known all these things when we're all on a learning journey. A really effective strategy is inviting people to travel with you, recognizing we're all on journeys. And it's when there's not malintent, that we're not doing things that are shame-based, that it really is invitational-based and empathy-based. And one thing that I want to mention is that sometimes we accidentally perpetuate these kinds of like shocking narratives or examples, or try to be edgy in order to try to get people to pay attention to the problem. And just want to suggest that when we share our experiences or things that we witness, that our motivation really should be helping ourselves and others along on the journey, as opposed to, I see this a lot with implicit bias becoming this really popular term in training, as I've seen a lot of people warp it to say like, well, everyone has bias, so it's not a problem. Incorrect take. Everyone has bias, so we all have a responsibility to do something. And normalizing like your own experience and emotionality and leading with that, so that it doesn't feel isolating to the other person, but rather like, hey, we're all in this together. Mention the emotionality. If you are really good at perceiving how people might respond to something, that's one of my anxiety superpowers, is anticipating possible reactions, right? Then you can think through things beforehand. And we also have some research-based tools. For example, this one cited here is the most common reactions that folks have when they are having to reckon with their own personal biases. So if we know that this is sort of a typology of how people tend to respond, then we can equip ourselves to be able to handle that response, right? Of normalizing, like when I took an implicit association test, I felt like it was saying I was racist, and I don't think I am. And then I remembered that's not actually what this test is measuring, right? It's about these messages that society has given me over a lifetime, but my actions are what matter, right? Just a few final thoughts here. It can be really helpful, and sometimes it's a really limited space, but it can be really helpful to identify common ground. There's a lot of research that shows that finding common ground and working from there is one of the most effective strategies for folks having conversations about things they don't agree on. I'll give one example. So I was living in Oklahoma when bathroom bills about, which bathrooms trans people should or shouldn't be allowed to use started really becoming this big national discourse. And one of the things that I found was, if you know anything about Oklahoma demographics and typical politics, a lot of people that live in my adopted home state have very big investment in this idea of small government, personal autonomy, like these kinds of big overarching values. And there were ways that we could create space where I could communicate this message and people could get it in a way that was about shared values, as opposed to saying like, you're a horrible transphobe if you think that we should regulate bathroom usage, right? So instead framing it as like, hey, I know that you and I have talked before about how you really think like individual liberty is important and that like privacy from big government matters to you. That also matters to me, right? So when we think about it in the context of these bathroom bills, like my perspective is, what an invasion of privacy for the government to be like, I don't know, deciding who can use what restroom facility when all I'm trying to do is use the restroom, right? But instead we're proposing all of these things where we would like hyper monitor people's ID cards and like all of this kind of stuff. So like, I think maybe you can see where I'm coming from of like not really wanting to be like super monitored like that. And that's a talking point that reached a lot of people that I never would have imagined it would have reached. And people like, oh, I hadn't thought about it like that. Yeah, that would be pretty scary if I was trying to use the restroom and someone stopped me because I had short hair or because I had long hair or whatever it is. Research also shows that the most effective tools are a combination of data and storytelling. What we find is that simply presenting data to people without a powerful narrative actually can have a rebound effect in which it alienates people further. So we've also got to do storytelling, and that includes making things personal, having shared values, and also how we frame these conversations when we present the data. Again, meeting people where they are, but not to the point that you feel like you're compromising your own principles. But is there wiggle room where you can be extra patient with someone who shares a dominant identity for the sake of hopefully making some progress in the conversation, even if you're uncomfortable with sort of what the starting point is. For those of us in higher education, and there's other norms in other spaces like in business, actually found a lot of value in recognizing that like prestige rankings, this idea of external expertise that is sort of like accredited by where you went or what degree you, these kinds of things, while they can be problematic in certain ways and spaces, can also be a helpful tool, right? So when people are not enthused about the carrot, sometimes the stick of, well, if we continue to allow this kind of bias to manifest in our classrooms, there's actually a risk that we could lose our accreditation. And that is something that we just cannot allow to happen, right? Especially as a nationally ranked program, right? It might not even come across as a stick, right? It's reality. But thinking about strategic ways where it's like, okay, if this person is not convinced by moral arguments that we do no harm, or that it's not good to be transphobic in public, or things like that, what are the other systems that we can operate in? And preventing this stuff, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, or whatever the phrase is, right? So when we have policies and practices in place that minimize bias, it can really be helpful. As well as the fact that more than like repeated conversations tend to be more effective than one-offs. Again, that's what brought me to this kind of understanding from a very resistant place originally, is people following up and having those conversations, big and small, moment to moment. So I'll just leave you with the words of Angela Davis to take these with you. And she once said, you know, you have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. And I think that that really is a big part of how we advocate for you and for me, is thinking about this as an everyday practice and habit, as opposed to simply these big moments in our lives that might be pivotal or transformative for ourselves and others. But like normalizing this and thinking through like, yeah, this is an everyday process of how I choose to live my life, how I choose to be my best and favorite self, and how I can speak up for others and myself in ways that are strategic and that allow me to keep doing it tomorrow as well. And I truly have seen how these kinds of conversations can really change hearts and minds, but also systems and structures. So it is possible to make that kind of change, even if when we're too close to the situation, we don't always get to see the end results, especially if they're gradual. So I would like to wrap there and invite any comments folks have, any questions or clarifications, or sort of like burning thoughts that folks have before we close. Groovy. All right, I'm going to stop recording.